So welcome. My name is Darren Morgan, nursery manager here at Shonnard's, and we wanted to talk today about growing garlic and onions. We'll talk a little bit about shallots at the end too. They're very relevant to the conversation. So garlic and onions. So the allium family is a genus in the lily family. It's the primary edible plant group in the lily family. They are a fairly broad array of plants, but what we're going to be talking today about are the ones that actually form bulbs. So we're not going to talk a lot about things like leeks or chives or all those other edible alliums. We're going to focus on the major bulb formers. So these bulb forming alliums, garlic, onions, and shallots, have some things that are substantially in common that make them kind of fun crops to play with. One of the things about them is they are grown primarily as overwintered crops for harvest the following summer. There's some ways around that just to a small degree, but as a rule, that is the way you handle them. So they make a really good introduction to overwinter gardening. That was the first thing I ever grew as an overwintered plant in a vegetable garden. They do this because they are regulated not by temperature specifically, and nor by how long they've been in the ground like other vegetable crops, but they are triggered to set bulbs by the day length. And while for all garlics and shallots, that's kind of a moot issue, they're fairly adaptable across their timing. For onions, it's critical. Some onions will grow here, some onions will not grow here because of that feature. Many, but not all, offer great opportunities for long-term storage. So they can be relatively high-yielding plants with the capability of being stored, giving them quite a presence in your kitchen and in your vegetable supply. So other things that they have in common. So maturation is regulated by day length, not how long they've been in the ground. They're usually planted in the fall, grown over the winter, and then harvested in the summer. They're relatively hungry plants. Surprisingly, for the amount of foliage they put out, they really need a fairly substantial amount of nitrogen to do well, and that is one of the critical factors to having good success with alliums. They tend to be fairly soil adaptable, all in all, but they do best with substantially good drainage. Now, onions are more tolerant than most. But garlic and especially shallots need reasonable drainage. Most of them don't have much in the way of particular intolerances of soil pH. They're adaptable across the range. They do their best just slightly acidic, so soil's running around 6 or 7 in the pH. And because they all share a group of fairly significant disease organisms, crop rotation is very, very important. Do not grow garlic and or onions in the same spot year over year over year. You might get away with it for a while. You can develop problems that are relatively permanent in the soil that will prohibit you from growing garlic or onions in that soil for years and years and years, white mold, Startina. So just be aware of that issue. Practice good crop rotations. An ideal rotation is 2 years of other crops between allium crops in the same soil. The question.
How far do you need to move it from its original state?
Excellent question on rotation. How far do we need to separate them to achieve rotation? The actual area of soil that the plant is actually occupying. So this means in practical terms, about 2 or 3 feet is usually considered a separate space in terms of rotation for plants of this size. Obviously, with other types of crops, other type of crop rotation, sometimes that's larger areas, crucifers, corn, they could occupy larger profiles. So you can get away with every other year, but if you want to be on the safe side, I tend to recommend you be on the safe side. You do a 2-year gap. So you have a crop, you have 2 years with no crop, and then the 3rd year you go back in with alliums.
Do 2 years in a row.
Do not do 2 years in a row ever, and gap it at least a year, but gapping it by 2 years is better in terms of rotation for alliums. There's a real problem commercially. They've had this problem commercially with large-scale production of garlic in particular, of having these problems develop and then having to sell off the fields because they're never going to be able to do anything but that way in garlic land again. So yeah, be aware of that. Yes.
We got our onions sitting not very successfully in the same pot now for a couple of years. What do we do now?
Okay, so you've been growing onions in the same soil, same pot for
Yeah,
a
not
couple
very
years.
successfully.
Yeah. So,
Also not a lot of, this is a couple of just a pot of other things,
mhm,
it's not like a mono.
It's true, it's.
okay,
And it's a pot, so it's isolated thing, and probably not relevant.
okay, but let's hold that, because when we get into the onion culture, we'll address some of those, because
Okay.
there's a couple of things that you're likely running into here that are giving you the problem. So let's start off with garlic. Garlic is a really consistent and easy crop. True failure in garlic is relatively rare. Degrees of success, depending on how you're growing them, is more commonly the issue. Plants planted, bulbs planted in September, October, November, maybe as late as December, will produce very good sized bulbs going into the next year, usually June. Average harvest for me is about third week of June. Individual varieties in garlic will have some variation on when they're ready. There's lots and lots of varieties to choose from. And I would just encourage you to play around with different varieties and find what you really love, because it's not necessarily the same as what you're buying in the grocery store. And there are distinct enough characteristic flavor differences to make them quite unique. So best selection for garlic is now. It's all landing right now. September and October, usually we still have good supply. By the time you get into winter, we start running out of some of the more popular varieties. So by Thanksgiving or so, you can continue in theory to plant garlic through the winter, all the way up through maybe early March at the very latest. But once you get past maybe early to mid-November, you're going to have smaller and smaller yields, smaller and smaller bulbs, because they just don't have as long in the ground for, again, finishing fixed by day length. Choose bulbs that are well intact. So ideally you want bulbs that have paper still on them and that are not soft to the touch. It's not uncommon, especially about a month from now, to start seeing green tips already emerging from the bulbs for sale. And that's just fine, as long as the bulb isn't really wrinkling down and hasn't depleted its stored energy. We'll hit this in the next slide for a minute, but this is a bulb of garlic containing a batch of different cloves. And for planting, you will separate out the individual cloves and plant the individual cloves. Each clove you plant should produce a bulb somewhat like the one you planted with. So the yield can be quite good. With that in mind, how much garlic are you going to eat? How much do you want to grow? A pound of seed garlic, usually about 3-ish bulbs of garlic, usually has enough cloves in it to plant between 20 and maybe 25 row feet, with a harvest potential of 5 to 7 to maybe 8 pounds. So, you know, figure a 1 to 6 is probably a reasonable return. 1 pound planted, 6 pounds harvested. Again, the bulb and clove in close-up, because I know it doesn't show so great through the camera or from a distance. So bulbs and cloves, you separate them out and plant the cloves separately. Don't try to clean them up. A little bit of the callus root tissue on the bottom attached to one or more of the bulbs is normal. Leave the paper on. Don't try to take the paper off. But if some of it comes off, it's not a big deal. Very normal. So category, you can get really crazy on distinguishing varieties of garlic, artichoke types, whatever. But broadly, we'll say there's 3 major categories. There are hardneck garlics. So hardnecks have an outer row of cloves, and when they set a flower spike, it comes out separate from the center of that row of cloves. They typically are easy to peel. They're typically very warm or rich in flavor, but they don't store a long time. A good storage life on a hardneck garlic might be 3 months, maybe 4 months. Softnecks still offer good flavor. Flavors typically are not quite as hot, sometimes not as rich. The bulbs tend to be large, and they tend to be a lot of cloves in them because they have the same outer row of major cloves, but then the whole interior is filled up with smaller and smaller and smaller cloves. all of which are at least theoretically edible if you want to take the time to peel them. Soft necks don't peel quite as clean as hard necks. One of the things I love about hard necks is being able to just crack it with the knife handle and just peel the shell off rather than having to dig it out with the knife blade. But they store. So the garlic that you're harvesting in June might last you through May or June of the following year when you have the next harvest on, at least in good storage conditions. Elephant garlic is different. Elephant garlic is technically a leek, still forms a bulb though. So this is a single clove of elephant garlic. Bulbs are often like 2 hand sized with 5 or 6 or 7 cloves like this in the garlic. Elephant garlic, we treat it very much like a hardneck garlic. Big cloves, good storage life, easy peel. Better than hardneck, not as good as softneck in terms of overall storage. I find them a bit excessively mild personally, but if you want to get a kind of a general garlic flavor into a dish in volume, they're not bad. They just don't have the intensity and richness of the true garlics. Yes.
Did you say the hardneck stores?
Hardnecks might store for 3 months, 4 months. I've got the last of my June hardnecks are starting to look June harvest hardnecks are starting to look really rough right now. So that's pretty typical. I seldom have my hardnecks store all the way through Christmas, but occasionally up to Thanksgiving from June and early July harvest.
Do you think that there's an equal amount of like nutrient value between the different?
Nutritionally, I don't think there's much variation amongst the garlics. If you actually plunk them in on a calorie counter, they all just come up as a generic valuation. There might be some micronutrient value variation, but there shouldn't be much. They're pretty similar all in all. So hardneck varieties, really hard to go wrong with hardnecks. That all of them perform quite well here. The individual cloves average large because they don't have all those little cloves sucking energy out of the middle. Flavors are rich. Excellent varieties to play with. I include the German Reds, Rojas, Music. We got some Medici this year, so we'll see what that one's like. I haven't grown that one personally yet. And when you're planting garlic, you can plant your rows softneck and your row hardneck. You can throw them all together. It's really easy at harvest to tell if it's a hardneck or a softneck variety to know what to do with it, which ones to use first. The differences are quite notable. So softneck varieties, also lots of them out there. I do a lot of Enchelium myself and early Italian purple. Late Italian's a good one. Nootka Rose is a well-regarded one with particularly large clove size. And all of these have really substantially good yields with lots of smaller cloves inside the outer ring of bigger cloves. They all yield well, they all store really well. Some of them are famous for particularly long storage lives. Enchelium is a good one too for them. One of the reasons I grow so much. I find Enchelium to have one of the better flavors overall of the softnecks. I do early Italian purple because when all else fails, it's really consistent. So if I have a totally messed up year with too much water, or I get them in late, or I forget to feed them once or even twice in the cycle, I still get decent cloves out of the early Italian purple. The elephant garlic usually is just the one variety, just sold as elephant garlic. Yield is tremendous, but you end up using quite a bit more of it per dish to get the flavor in case. Storage life is as good as, or is better than hardnecks, but not as good as softnecks, but not bad at all. It tends to hold fairly well. So, planting your garlic. The garlic's an easy plant to grow. Drainage needs to be reasonable, does not have to be perfect. I grow garlic in my main vegetable garden, which is a quite wet location. Decide how much you need. A pound of garlic will plant 20 to 25 row feet with 7 to 8 pound yield, and make sure that the area you're going to plant is well prepared. You might need to make sure you've got any crop debris and detritus cleared up. All weeds are cleared out, and any encroaching plants that are just finishing their cycle that are still in the garden, at least trimmed back with preparation for getting them out safely without damaging the garlic in the process. So how far? Well, from the center of your row, you really need about 2 feet of clearance, 18 inches to 2 feet of clearance on both sides. Don't let things encroach in. So alliums as a group are small plants, but that means they have these kind of broad, shallow root systems. They are very intolerant of competition. That applies to the whole group. So do your site prep, work some compost in. We use the richer compost like we do in the vegetable garden, like Harvest Supreme. That's a 15% chicken manure in a basic compost. But make sure you're getting compost in, you're reworking the soil, even if you had a vegetable garden in it this year, because those soils are pretty well depleted and compacted after a year of growing in them. Create your planting furrow. You can do individual blocks, you can do rows, you can do grids, all kinds of options, but get your planting area prepped so that you can dig a furrow to plant the bulbs in that is at least 6 inches deep for the furrow. It's a good idea to feed right at planting. Composts usually do not have enough nutrients in them in and of themselves to provide the nutrition to finish a crop. Garlic, like all the alliums, is relatively nitrogen hungry. I use a granular vegetable food, granular organic vegetable food. It's Whitney Farms, Gardner and Bloom this year. This is what I use at home. Label directions, but a good handful per few row feet, right in the bottom of the trench. And then you can also put a little sulfur in there. Anecdotally, but not scientifically, they say that a little bit of elemental sulfur both wards off some of the fungal diseases and also maybe richens up the flavor a bit. The flavor is a sulfur compound. That's anecdotal. I've heard that a lot. I've done it occasionally. I don't know that I've actually measured a serious flavor difference, but it's not a bad thing to attempt and see what you think yourself. Definitely does reduce some disease problems. Acidifies the soil. That can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing. If you're on relatively neutral or even slightly alkaline side, it's great. If you're already fairly acidic, be careful, especially when you're adding both organic mass and sulfur in, that you don't get so acidic that you have a decline in performance due to that.
How do you figure that out?
Well, you can do pH tests to figure that out. Most of them are accurate to within about a half a point with a probe or one of the little chemical reagent tests. Usually good enough to get to know where you're at. Be aware that pH changes over time, over watering patterns, over fertilization patterns. Not a bad idea to keep an eye on your vegetable garden pH at least every few years anyway, just to see where you're at. We tend to be acidic. My garden with just cover cropping and moderate fertilizing runs about 6 1/4, which is just fine for most crops. So preparing the cloves to plant is just simply breaking the cloves apart from the bulb. Leave as much paper on as stays on readily. You don't have to get really fanatic about it, but don't intentionally strip the paper off. You don't need to. When you open out a clove, like this German red, you'll find that pretty much all of the cloves are plantable. They're all of a nearly uniform size, and just separate them out and plant every single clove. As a picture you see on the screen is this a soft neck garlic, and that outer ring of cloves is great to plant, but when you get into the interior, you've got all these smaller, wedgy, less pronounced bulbs. If you have the space, patience, and don't care about getting some small bulbs in return, you can plant them, they'll grow, but you're not likely to get as big of a finished bulb out of those smaller interior cloves as you do out of the big ones on the outer perimeter. So usually I'll just plant the 6 or 7 or 8 bigger bulbs around the outer edge and just take all those little ones and put them in my cooking tray and use them up in cooking over the next few weeks instead. When you're planting your cloves, you can actually see where the roots attached originally. So you have a distinctively pointy end of the clove, and that goes up. And on the bottom is the callus where the roots were attached and where the new roots will come out. That obviously goes down. A little bit off one way or the other, fine, but don't plant them upside down. So planting your garlic, have your site prepped, your furrow worked, fertilizer in the bottom, roughly 6 inches deep, and space your individual cloves in that furrow. I go for 6 inches apart. 5 inches is probably adequate. 4 inches is likely to impact your yield if you go all the way down to 4 inches apart. So about 6 inches apart. If you look at the base of your clove being somewhere around that 6 inches, we said you dug your furrow, that puts the top of the bulb somewhere around 4 or 5 inches down, and that's in a good depth for garlic. My early mistakes with garlic was planting them too shallow at 2 and 3 inches down. 2 or 3 inches down, they didn't really bulb really well. But when I get down there at a full 6 inches down, I get really nice big bulbs. Elephant garlic is proportionately bigger. It needs to be planted a bit deeper. It needs more space between. We assume that you're going to plant your elephant garlic something around 8 inches apart and at 6 to 8 inches deep for a good yield. Keep the area clear. So go on with care, but make sure you don't have things encroaching in weed-wise over the course of the winter while they're growing, and make sure when you're laying out your rows that you have at least 18 inches between individual rows of garlic for separation. Then once you've got those all laid out in your furrow, you can backfill, tamp lightly. Don't overpress, there's no need to. You got plenty of moisture coming in that will settle that soil around them. And it's a really great idea to put a nice layer of compost mulch over the top, 2 or 3 inches of mulch right over the top of the row. Does a wonderful job for growing the garlic and doesn't put them too deep. So garlic will sprout over the fall, fall to winter. Planted now, I normally expect to see my garlic showing up at something around 4 weeks post-planting, sometimes 5. I've occasionally been worried and it finally came up about 5.5 weeks. Which gets a little edgy because you really can't do anything about it at that point. But don't be surprised if it takes a little while, but you should see them coming up in the late fall and early winter. Your granular fertilizer was great to get them going. And with granular organics, the issue is as your soil temperatures drop, as the day length shortens more and more, the microbial activity in the soil slows down, and organic granular fertilizers are dependent upon those microbes to break that fertilizer into forms that plants can use. But we would like to get a little more size on them, if at all possible, before they really stop growing in that January, late December and January growth period. So we like to put on a liquid fertilizer, again, liquid organic. Focus again on nitrogen. Yes, they are a bulb crop, but it's the foliage mass that will determine how big your bulbs get. So liquid organic fertilizer, mix it up in a watering can and just water down the row with it. Does a really good job. I do that usually about second week of November if I don't get caught up in other things. Doesn't do much good if you wait all the way till December, but anytime after they've sprouted and before Thanksgiving is usually great for them. So they will slow down dramatically in the second half of December and all through January. By early February, you might notice that they're starting to actually get bigger again, noticeably growing. Again, that's a good time to throw another batch of liquid fertilizer on them because, again, they're still not using the granular fertilizers well out of the soil. And then I side dress another batch of a granular fertilizer in usually end of February, first part of March. And that will be the last fertilization, and that will get them all the way through harvest in June. Can you skip some of those fertilizations? Yes. If your goal is the biggest yield possible, I would recommend you do all 4 of those feedings. So they grow, they slow, they start growing again, and all of a sudden you realize that they're about knee high or so. Throughout this growing period, winter, spring, and into the early summer, make sure you're policing the weeds. Don't allow weeds to grow in the row. They're just simply stealing space and nutrition from your garlic plants. They are somewhat drought tolerant. However, if we're getting substantially dry in April or May, you might need to be set up to irrigate. They're not super thirsty, but you can have a diminishing of yield if you if you provide no water and we're substantially dry in the early part of the season. Wow, skipped a stage. They might, particularly hardnecks, tend to set a flower stem and a little pigtail of flower scape, a little flower bud that opens into a flower. You can remove those. It makes minimal difference in overall yield. You can leave them on. It's totally up to you. If you take them off, stir fry them or something like that, they're perfectly edible and then quite tasty. But if you look at side-by-side examples on a large scale, where you have large fields and say, well, we let these flower and we left the flowers on, these started flowering, we cut the flowers off. There is a measurable difference. You get a slightly higher yield if you take the flower scapes off. But when you're growing 10 or 12 cloves, you probably won't notice that difference. It's that tiny. So sometime around midsummer, June, going into the latter half of June, perhaps, you'll start noticing that despite providing water when needed and your good fertilizing practices through the late winter and spring, that the leaves are starting to yellow from the basal leaves, nearest to the ground leaves, and kind of working their way up. This is the garlic telling you I'm done. Okay, I'm finishing up. So when you start seeing that, stop watering. It's really important you withhold water for 2 to 3 weeks prior to harvest, or your paper rots off and your bulbs separate and you have a garlic that you might be able to still eat but will not store. It has no potential for storage anymore. You can lose the crop that way if you're substantially over irrigating, period. So they'll continue to yellow up from there if you cut the water off, and you don't have to wait till the entire plant's all yellow. You don't have to bend them over. But when you're down to just a couple of leaves on the top, still showing any substantial amount of green, good time to get them out of the ground. Garlic does not ground store. If you leave it in past the point where it's finished, again, the papers will start disintegrating, the cloves will start separating out, they'll start trying to vegetatively propagate themselves, they'll try to fall away from each other so they can grow individual bulbs themselves. And that is problematic for harvest as well as for storage. When you first get them out of the ground, they're really not great for cooking or using. They're still green at that point. They need to cure. I throw mine in standing upright with the tops on in 5-gallon buckets in the garage. Well enough space for good air circulation. You can lay them out instead. That's probably better. I just don't have that kind of garage space. Air circulation, warm, dry, not in the sun. 2 to 3 weeks of that, they will finish curing. The actual cloves themselves will be usable. And that's at a point you can actually remove the foliage, or if you prefer, braid the foliage. You'll need to re-wet it at that stage to get a braid. Once they're cured, they store pretty well at moderate to warm temperatures and dry, and they're not particular about being lit or dark. Darker might hold them just a tiny bit longer, but no substantial differences. So 3 to 4 months on hard necks, soft necks, 10, 12 months once they're fully cured. So onions can also be a high yielding crop. They're a little more temperamental than garlic. Simply, there's more things that can go wrong in the process. Unlike garlic, there are lots of different options for planting and timing, different ways you can handle them. So we'll spend a fair amount of time on that aspect of it. So the types of onions. Bulb-forming onions, as opposed to bunching onions or scallions, are grouped into categories by how they respond to day length. In other words, what point in the day length variation through the year do they set their bulbs, which is what you want. So long day onions respond to a light period somewhere around 14 hours. Short day onions start their bulbing when the day length is less than 12 hours. And intermediate, sometimes called day neutral varieties, usually start their bulbing at 12 to 14 hour day length. We can grow intermediates here just fine. Mostly we grow long day onions. If we try to grow Vidalias or some other classic southern onions, they don't grow here. They don't bulb right because they don't grow during the period they would normally be bulb setting. Our weather is not suitable for growing. So basically, bunching onions past that are quite suitable for any type of environment. They're not picky about day length because you're not really going for a bulb. Onions can be planted from seed directly in the garden, but there's challenges to that. It's summer planting. Onions can be started from seed in pots or trays, and then those seedlings, once they're up to a given maturity, can be separated out for planting. And that can be done summer, fall, usually not midwinter just because they don't grow fast enough but they would tolerate it, or very early spring, so February into March. Some onions are also available as green bunches. So if you started your onions from seed in July and you grew them in a sand bed or an easy dig bed of some sort, and then because you had concerns about wintering them or because you had them too concentrated for finishing, you lifted all those baby onions and you clean them off and you package them and you ship them out and sold them, that's bunches. Somebody's taken the time to do the seed starting through greens develop stage, and then you can transplant them. That takes a lot of the things that can go wrong in onion growing out of it and putting it on the people who are growing them professionally. Those are available for a narrow period of time in February and into early March, and that's when you would need to plant them. And the other way, of course, is from sets. Sets are simply onion bulbs, kind of a similar thing where you've got an onion that was grown previously up to a size, dried down for being able to pull it and ship it, and now is ready to plant as a stored bulb. They are available fall, winter, and spring. You will get best success out of them from fall plantings. So doing onions from seed, the timing is critical. This is one of the biggest challenges to doing your own onions from seed. You're doing your seeding of your onions in your garden in July, late July, early August, maybe through mid-August. One of the worst periods of time for keeping seed wet enough to germinate in your garden. So if you're going to direct sow them, you're likely to be needing to water that little area substantially more frequently than the rest of the garden. So you either create a starting bed or a cold frame to start them in, or you start them in trays where you can control that and you're hand watering anyway, and then grow them on it for transplant. When you're direct sowing in the ground, you want to sow about 3 seeds per inch, roughly. They're tiny seeds, so estimate as best you can. They'll sprout up. It takes them a fairly substantial period of time to get size. They sprout relatively fast, but their development of top growth and of course root growth to go commensurate with that is relatively slow. So when they're around 2, 3, getting up to 4 inches, make sure you're separating them, you're thinning them out, because if you leave them at 3 per inch, you will get green onions and nothing else. Separate them down to about a 3 or 4 inch spacing between individual plants. If you're really gentle during the spacing, you may be able to salvage some of those thinnings and replant, but you may not. It's kind of hard on them to handle like that. For starting transplants, you want to seed even a little denser. 4 to 6 seeds per cell in a 6-pack is pretty common. They will take something around 8 to 9 to maybe 10 weeks from seed to be transplantable. It takes, I told you, it takes time for those things to develop out. They're a kind of a pain to separate out. I usually will take them out of the cell pack and separate them out under water. And I will often separate them to 2 or 3s, plant those, and then make sure I've got successful survivors, and then just pinch out the weaker plants a few weeks later after they've established again. Transplants are the most flexible for timing. You could do them right now. Transplants from seed, you could do them right now. You could do them in November. You could do them in February and March. You could do them anything later than about the first week of March. You will probably not actually bulb. You'll just have green. It's time. Day length matters. Onions from sets. Sets are available widely. People have preferences about fall or spring planting sets, but overall fall is more successful. Irregularities on the grower end during the production when they're growing these on and then drying them down for harvest, or irregularities post-planting in your own garden tend to increase the risk of bolting, setting a flower spike. Now, a flower spike on garlic is no big deal. Flower spike on onion is the cessation of development of the bulb. It won't get any bigger. It limits the amount of the bulb that is usable, and it eliminates any chance of having any storage life out of that bulb. So it's a semi-failure. We'll talk more about that in a moment. So sets, hard sets, are not available for sweet onions. They group onions as sweet or storage based on their sugar content. That does not mean sweets are always mild and sweet. Different varieties have different characteristics. But sweet onions have more sugar content, and you can't get a finished bulb like this for transplant. You can get sweets as bunches, but not as sets. Choose bulbs that are intact, firm. Paper on is great. Some paper missing is normal, no big deal. But not wrinkled, no soft spots, no large scale or obvious blemishes. Later in the season in particular, you might see a little bit of green emerging from the tip, and that's okay as long as it's not to the point, again, of depleting the bulb and shriveling out. A pound of onion sets will plant between 20 and 30 row feet. Yield, I'm not even going to guess a number because it's tremendously variable depending on what your overall success percentage is. But I would anticipate you're somewhere in that similar to garlic yield range overall, slightly higher likely. So whether you're doing the transplanting from, straight from seed is one thing, it's pretty straightforward. If you're doing the transplants from sets or from bulb or from bunches, all the basic site preparation is all the same. You still need to clear all of your plant debris, crop residues, weeds, cover crops, if you already have cover crops growing by now, which ideally you should, but often we don't. Make sure those are all well cleared out of the planting area, again, around an 18-inch separation from the rows. Do a good job of amending the soil, make the soil nice and rich. Onions are more wet tolerant than garlic. That does not mean they like to be underwater, and that's one of my challenges in my particular soil profile. But they do like a rich soil, and they do like real consistent moisture. You only want to make your planting furrow around 2 or 3 inches deep for onions. You do not want them anywhere near as deep as your garlic is. And make sure, again, you work plenty of granular fertilizer in right before planting. So once your block or your row has been dug and prepared and dug and furrowed, you can plant your sets. Plant your sets, your bulb sets, so that the top of the set is approximately an inch below the finished soil level. So not clear down here like with garlic, but relatively shallow. Typical for me is a 2-inch trench. These bulbs are usually between 1 and 1.5, and I'm going to mulch over the top of them. 3 to 4 inches is a good spacing. If space is not a consideration, you will get slightly better yields if you go out to 6 inches on average. More than that is not necessary. I get really good yields between 3 and 4 inches, so that's good enough for me, and it conserves a little space. Bunches are a little different. Of course, we don't have any samples this time of year, but you can see what a cluster of bunches looks like in the picture there. So bunches come in February, roughly right around Valentine's Day, and are persistently available into March, but not usually by the end of March. We're running out. A cluster like that you buy will usually have something between 50 and 75 plants. So you are committing to a fairly substantial block of space when you buy a bunch of onions. So if your space is limited, you might consider sharing that with neighbors instead, splitting a batch. You can get sweet onions as bunches, as I mentioned. You can also get often storage onions like Cobras or Pattersons as bunches as well. So both are available. Typically, bunches are planted something around 2 to 2.5 inches deep in the soil, which means that's the bottom of your hole. Typically, if you're looking at them, you're going to see a little bit of stem and paper. There's that paper that comes up from the base of the plant and up over the green stems. You want to be able to still see a little bit of that paper sticking up above the ground. You shouldn't be burying the whole pale stem and paper part of the plant. Again, 3 to 4 inches is good spacing. A little bit bigger is fine if you have the space to give. Fill up and make sure they're standing relatively straight. And then mulch lightly with compost. Onions are sensitive to rotting off if they have a lot of compost in contact with the stems themselves. So we want to side dress the compost or ring mulch them, not actually bringing the compost in contact with the green parts of the plant. So from sets, that simply means you put a thin layer over the top. You don't have to worry about it because they're going to grow up through it and disturb it as need be. But for bunches, just side dress the compost around. Typically, we don't compost as heavily on onions as we do on garlic. If you're doing like 3 inches or so of compost on garlic, you do an inch on onions, you're getting plenty down there. Big reason we want to compost with onions is moisture retention. So that's the thing to keep in mind. Thoroughness of covering is probably more overall important than depth of covering. So your transplants are similar, just a tiny bit more challenging to work with because it's harder to separate them out without breaking them or tearing them. Generally separate them under running water or in a bucket of water. That does help. You can bare root them, but the roots are tiny, so they're very subject to damage. I typically don't. I'll typically take them out in little pinches of 2 or 3 seedlings. Again, have all your prep done ahead of time. You want your transplants about 1 to 2 inches deep to the bottom of their root. So again, they're relatively shallow. Normally you go 3 to 4 inches apart if you're highly confident that your transplants are going to take. I will often go a little bit closer and just thin aggressively afterwards. It's a trade-off because transplants from 6-packs, if you're not starting your own, are relatively expensive to buy. So it may behoove you to go ahead and go some spacing and just allow the occasional mortality. Once you've got them set at your depth, backfill gently around them so they're nice and vertical, and mulch again lightly with compost. Again, avoid composting the green part of the plant. So onions will sprout from sets in the fall, from bunches. They'll take off right out of the green that's already there. Your transplants are already growing tip. They will grow slightly through the fall and stop in the winter, picking up again about February. The liquid fertilizer is still a good idea on them. Nitrogen is a limiting factor for them. So liquid feed November, liquid feed in February as growth resumes. A second dose of granular fertilizer in March will improve your yields. They're extremely intolerant of competition. My garlic does okay if I don't get out there and weed all the time. My onions do not. They really have to be kept really clean throughout the whole winter. So keep them consistently weeded all through the growing season. As we get through the winter and into the later parts of spring, we often go through windows of time where we start drying down. This is great because you can till your soil, you can start planting your garden. For onions, this is not good. They are not drought tolerant at all to speak of. So they need about 1 inch of water a week. If they're not getting it in rain, you're going to need to apply it. So be very consistent about checking them and making sure they're staying dry. Because if they get dried out, or if they get especially variable, or they get kind of dry and they get saturated wet, that's again where you're going to have bolting problems. That's the single biggest cause of bolting, is irregularities in moisture. So bolting is a partial failure. The bolted plant, just when you see that flower stalk emerging, simply get that bulb out. It's not going to do anything more. It's not going to develop anything more. And give it a brief curing period and then use it. So it's not going to store. You'll find that if you slice open a bolted onion, that the flower stem goes all the way through the center of the core of the onion bulb, and actually develops a separate little paper coating in there between the rings of the onion, and that which then deteriorates, rots, and causes the whole onion to rot in storage. So that's why they're done at that point. It's really common as we get later into the season to see your onions shouldering up and even pushing out of the soil. That is perfectly normal, and it's perfectly fine. If it bothers you, it bothers some people. If it bothers you, it's okay to bring some mulch up into the bulb a little bit, up the side of the bulb a bit, but leave that top and that neck clear up in the air so that they don't rot. This is often the next biggest cause of rotting problems in storage is too aggressive a mulching or reburying during the pushing up. Again, sometime around midsummer, June, July, you'll see what you see in the picture here. You'll see the necks starting to go soft. At first, it'll look kind of normal, green, but just bending over, kind of getting weak and wilty. And you think, what am I done with my onions? What's wrong with my onions? Normal process at that time in the season. They will continue to fold on over. If you see that starting to happen, stop watering. Let them have 2 or 3 weeks of dry down before you dig and harvest. Unlike garlic, as long as you're not watering them, you can leave onions in dry soil ground and ground store them for substantial periods of time, just going out and picking a few at a time as you need them until the rains start coming in again. Obviously, that becomes the limiting factor. So and I don't grow enough of them for that to be an issue for me. My father does. He grows many, many row feet of onions. And he just cuts off the irrigation, and we go out there and pick them, and then we go out in usually September and try to get the last of the salvageable ones out of the ground. Insects are a problem with ground stored, less on onions and some root crops. Once you are dried down, and you'll start seeing, like I say, just like this, and yellow leaves will go completely yellow after they've finished bending on over. Get them out gently and store them for curing. Again, warm, dry, not in the sun. Let them cure out for about 2 to 3 weeks before you go into long-term storage mode. I normally leave the tops on during that phase, although stuff I was picking in August leaves had already withered in their ground store. The leaves had already withered anyway, so it wasn't any big deal. Sweet onions, Walla Walla sweets, the most common one here, might store, 6 weeks, 8 weeks under refrigeration and careful care. That's about it. That's why I don't grow too many of them personally. Storage onions can last 8 to 10 months under good conditions and typically not refrigerated, typically dry, moderate temperature storage. I use the garage a lot for that. Even through the winter, it doesn't freeze. It's well enough protected, it doesn't freeze. Long-term storage of storage onions in those conditions means separating them enough so they've got some air circulation, so they don't develop moisture in between the bulbs and rots. And cushioning them, I just lay out sheets of cardboard in the garage and set them out on that, so that they're not sitting on a really, really hard surface, which can often cause bruising and rotting from there. So that's kind of the skinny on onions. Now, shallots are, as they are, kind of somewhere in between all these factors. So shallots are available as bulbs. You can also do shallots from seed. It takes a long time, so most people don't. Shallot bulbs like this may be an individual bulb, so look carefully under the paper. Plant them entire if they're an individual bulb, but often enough, there are multiple cloves, like a garlic, so if that's the case, separate them out for planting. You want to plant your shallots shallow, like onions. Maybe even a little shallower. I like to put mine so where I can just almost see the point coming out of the ground. But I'm on a particularly wet soil, and that's why. They detest wet feed in the winter. Not tolerant of getting a substantial amount of moisture on the bulb itself. So shallow like onions, but well spaced like garlic, 6 or 7 inches apart is a good idea. Still keep them isolated from other plants, keep them weeded, 18-inch spacing between rows. Once you've got your furrow done and your bulbs planted, same basic prep and furrow development, except I would focus on about a 3-inch or so furrow to get them appropriate depth in the ground, 3 to 4 inch furrow. Get the bulbs in, get them covered and mulch them. Mulch them like with garlic, get a good thorough layer of mulch on them, they appreciate that. Keep them thoroughly weeded throughout the entire season. They are substantially picky about getting dried out too fast in the spring. It reduces your yield. They're substantially picky about getting flooded in the winter. So well-drained site, and then water them as the spring dries down. They are likely to push up like onions do, and that's fine. But instead of a bulb, you will typically get a cluster, and usually not as tight as a garlic bulb, but a cluster of shallot bulbs from each bulb you plant. Normally, I get my shallots off about 2 weeks ahead of my garlic in middle part of June, give or take. So as we start seeing them sizing up and pushing up, we'll just cut off the water. I don't wait for any foliage symptoms. I just cut off the water for about 2 weeks completely and let them dry down for harvest. They're not as picky about that dry down as long as they're in a dry soil, but if you're like watering every day, make sure you at least have a few days to dry them down before you pluck. So shallots don't store as long as long storing garlic, but they have a pretty decent storage life, several months. It's real common. So that's the skinny on onions and garlic and shallots. And at this point in time, I would entertain any questions from the live crew here or from the online attendees. Yes.
So are multiplier onions very similar to shallots?
Yes, multiplier onions are very similar to a shallot. They reproduce off from bulbils. They're actually different species of allium. They're not your traditional allium cepa. But yeah, there's a couple of different types of multipliers in that sense, and walking onions and such too. So,
So are those? That's what I grow. I have from like shallots.
Yeah, so you can plant them. Usually, I've seen them usually done from seed. Though, if you have somebody who gives you a batch of bulbs, that's an easy way to get them going too. Multiplier onions are often perennialized. So you plant them in, you harvest out, you leave some behind, and they continue to regrow. And that's a valid approach. Be aware that diseases are real. And that this could become a problem down the road. You need to take them up, not grow anything allium in there for a long period of time and move them elsewhere, or plant a fresh batch, I should say, elsewhere. There are different species of onion that are not anywhere near as susceptible to some of these European diseases as the common commercial varieties. So they're not as susceptible. They're not immune. Even chives can get some of these diseases, but they're less likely, less prone to some of these serious diseases. So
They're not European.
the diseases are the European diseases. These diseases happen like in a lot of agriculture because we have isolated characteristics we desire out of these crops and then intentionally bred these plants for these characteristics, not usually for disease resistance or pest resistance. Multiplier onions are more wild. They grow more like a wild crop. They do not grow anywhere near as big. Yeah. Right. Other questions here in-house? Any questions from online? All right, well, we'll let you go from there. I want to thank you all for attending. It's a nice class, and I'm around for a bit. If you got any follow-up questions, we obviously have onions and garlic and shallots available for sale now because it's time to get them in the ground. I hope to get mine in the ground this week if I don't get busy again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.